Some of the major developments in biofuels related to the policy discussions over how best to make biofuels more sustainable. This has especially been a very pertinent discussion within the EU region because their biofuels policies were explicitly modeled around the idea that biofuels would help avoid fossil fuel emissions, rather greenhouse gas emissions coming from fossil fuel use within the transportation sector. And they'd set for themselves some fairly ambitious targets. So for instance, they'd wanted to have a about 5.75% replacement of fossil fuels with biofuels by 2010, and that would go up to even 10% in 2020. So they had set for themselves some pretty ambitious goals, and then science research pointed out some concerns that there could be some environmental impacts that biofuels cause, not necessarily through the production process itself, but more through the way in which the feedstock crops like oil crops from rapeseed or sunflower for biodiesel or sugarcane for ethanol, that those might create land use changes, and there could be GHG greenhouse gas emissions from the feedstock crops that are making the biofuels that could offset those savings. So this has sparked a whole bunch of scientific as well as policy level debate. And starting from 2010, actually, the European Commission, taking this issue very seriously because sustainability, as I mentioned, is very important for them, commissioned a large body of work to be done through various groups. And IFPRI happened to be one of them. And a report was produced for consideration by the European Commission on the magnitude and impact and likely offsetting effects that land use changes could have on the sustainability aspects of biofuels. It was well received, and that report did point out a great degree of uncertainty, which is more or less where we are now. So we know that there is likely to be an impact. And the impact will depend on what types of feedstock crops you used, the methods of their production and where they are produced. But there's a large range because in some cases it's not clear exactly what the mechanism of land use change is. We're doing this from modeling work, but depending on what kind of a model you have and what kind of a mechanisms that model uses to simulate changes in the landscape, you could get different results. So we're at a point where we know that there is an effect. There's policy initiative to narrow down sort of the range of uncertainty through more studies, but that is still to be done. So that's essentially where we are in terms of the issue of indirect, and we call it indirect land use change from biofuels, because in some cases, some of the more serious land use impacts that lead to greenhouse gas emissions are not from what happens directly when you convert, let's say, maize land into, or land within the US or within the EU into maize or into oil seeds, but what happens elsewhere in the world. Because let's say if the US produces more maize, that means, or rather if the US uses more of its maize supply for biofuels production, that means that there's less exports of maize from the US, which means that likely the world price is going to go up because the U.S. is a major exporter of maize, which means that that price signal is going to induce other people to grow more maize to replace the lost export that used to come from the U.S., and that leads to land use change elsewhere. So you can see that's a very complex chain of causality, and in principle we know that that happens, and we've seen it happen in the past, but to show conclusively that those land use changes that happened in this particular country came as a result of a particular, let's say, the use of maize in the U.S., that a particular cause like that is difficult. So the attribution based on purely simulation-based model research is difficult, and I think there's been a lot of pushback from biofuel producers groups who think that it's not fair to penalize, for them to be penalized for things that are happening outside of the country, and there's arguments as to why that may not be the best instrument to use. But so that's essentially where we are. I mean, I've talked a lot about the EU, but even within the U.S. in 2011, there was a lot of discussion in terms of the place of biofuels. The U.S. has been revising its own renewable fuel standard. The U.S. since 2000, actually since even before 2007, when the Energy Independence and Security Act was enacted, there's been also a move towards doing more with biofuels from maize in particular, because that's a major feedstock crop. It's grown in great quantities, and the cost of converting it into biofuels is relatively low compared to other alternative feedstocks. And that amount of ethanol from maize has been growing dramatically since 2005, 2004. And it continues to grow. In fact, the U.S. has now overtaken the U.S. as a producer of ethanol in total volume. However, there's also been that concern about sustainability. There's also been concern about prices, because maize in the U.S. is more of a feedstock, a feed crop, rather a crop that's fed to livestock for animal feed. And so the price effects when you divert more of that maize into ethanol use has caused concern even within the U.S. among the livestock producers. So in fact, the result of concern from both the environmental side, and as well as people concerned about the food price effects, as well as people concerned about the amount of support that has been given to the domestic ethanol production sector in the U.S., led to essentially a repeal of the, well, the acronym is VTEC, but it's basically the excise tax credit that was given to ethanol producers in the U.S. as a compensation for per volume of the ethanol that they produce. So as of the beginning of 2012, there is no longer a tax credit that is given to ethanol producers. People who were very concerned about the fiscal situation and the debt situation in the U.S. pushed for that on the basis that they felt we shouldn't be compensating or giving producers subsidies for something that they're mandated to do anyway, according to the U.S. law. So there's been there's been that discussion. That was a major development that happened in the course of 2011. But there's also been other movements, other interests in terms of how do you also improve the sustainability of ethanol production or biodiesel or biofuels production within the U.S. to reach more the level in the EU. And actually, there's a number of people who have been looking at whether or not the California policy, because in the U.S. there's federal policy that happens at the national level, and then there's also individual states who have taken their own initiatives towards biofuels, such as the state of California, in which they specifically set targets for carbon reduction, rather the reduction of carbon emissions or carbon intensity in transportation fuels. And there's been research in terms of whether or not if you took that type of an approach and either replaced or augmented the national policy that currently exists in the U.S. with that kind of a low carbon fuel standard, whether or not you'd be able to achieve greater sustainability. A study has been underway. The final results are not, haven't been published or are not conclusive, but I think it's clear from the initial indicators that there is, if you do incentivize the reduction of carbon intensity in fuels directly as a policy, you will not completely eliminate the use of maize for ethanol, but you will reduce it substantially, and you might be able to then incentivize the production of ethanol from second-generation technologies such as cellulosic crops. These are dedicated energy crops such as switchgrass, miscanthus. They're essentially grasses which grow in a lot of the in open plains, or rather in areas that aren't necessarily used for food crop production. But through converting their cellulosic content into sugars that can then be fermented into oil, into alcohol, and into fuels, you achieve a much higher level of efficiency in terms of the conversion. I mean, there's a much greater energetic content per unit of mass that you convert in those types of a process. At the moment, they're not very cost competitive with so-called first-generation biofuels like those from ethanol, from maize. However, they do have great promise for the future, and so the argument has been that by directly incentivizing carbon reduction in the U.S. Renewable fuels policy, it gives therefore a greater incentive for these better second-generation crops to take off. More investment will happen in them. They will be able to take over sooner, and eventually replace a lot of the volume that's currently being, the ethanol volume that's currently being made from first-generation feedstocks like maize. Biofuels will continue to remain, will continue to be in business. I mean, the situation within the U.S. In 2012 going forward is very different from when it was really booming in the 2006-2007 period. Right now the industry is at break even, more or less. There's not a lot of profit, there's not a lot of growth in capacity of production. But there is a lot of maize that's there, and there still is a mandate for producing ethanol. So, in fact, the U.S. has now become a small net exporter of ethanol to countries like Brazil. So I think the U.S. will continue to remain a big producer, will continue to grow in this production. But these questions of sustainability, I think, will become more and more important in the policy debate. At the moment, there's not a lot of rather, the momentum for climate policy is not very strong within the U.S. But perhaps going forward, as the debate, as the discussion is able to resume around what really are the best ways of reducing the contribution of sectors such as transportation to the overall greenhouse gas emissions from the U.S. And what role does biofuels play, perhaps the issue.
That's fine, sorry.
Oh, no problem. So we're going to continue to have this discussion, and there will continue to be dynamics between the energy and the food sector, because now they are linked through the process of biofuels. Within the discussions that have taken place at the G20 level, the issues of food price volatility have featured strongly. The question in terms of how much biofuels did play a role in the past came up. There's no doubt that because of the large volumes of feedstock that are used towards producing ethanol from maize in the U.S. and biodiesel from oilseed crops in the EU, there's no doubt that having biofuels in the energy mix creates rigidities on the demand side, such that when you have sudden supply-side shocks or other market phenomenon, you will get more volatility. It's making the demand side less elastic, if you could put it that way. So there's more pressure on the demand side because of biofuels, and for that reason, there is going to be more of an incentive to look at alternatives that can eventually incentivize second-generation crops or feedstock crops that don't necessarily use directly the grain or the sugars from crops, but maybe the residues and other types of feedstocks that aren't necessarily grown on cropland. So that will definitely continue to be an issue in 2012 moving forward. And this issue of resolving the scientific uncertainty over how much biofuels really contributes to how much biofuels and the land use change that comes about as a result of biofuel production, how much that could really undermine the environmental sustainability that certain biofuels policies like the one in the EU tries to achieve. That will certainly be a topic of scientific debate in 2012, and I'm sure continuing forward.
I'm curious, the sustainability issue, this doesn't have to go on the video, but I'm just curious. Now, it sounds like what you're saying is that if we increase biofuel production in the U.S., that means that, you know, we're exporting less, so that leads to land use change in other countries. Couldn't that sometimes be a good thing?
In terms of the land use change, or in terms of the, I mean, the fact that the fact that when the prices go up as a result of decreased exports from the U.S., those people who grow maize, so the maize producers themselves, people in other countries who are net producers of maize, do benefit. They have higher prices. There's greater export opportunities for them as well. So there's no doubt that there's people who do benefit from the higher prices that come, be it a result of biofuels in the U.S. or any other cause. The question, though, in terms of whether or not the greenhouse gas emissions savings that you hope to have from introducing biofuels now into the transportation fuel mix, whether that will be offset by increased emissions from somewhere else as a result of that, is more the question that people are concerning themselves with. So You can do the calculations on paper, and it may look really good in terms of how much greenhouse gas emissions you're avoiding by substituting a fossil fuel with the biofuels. But these other indirect effects could also be significant. And the reason why it's difficult to pin them down is that the magnitude of those effects depend on where that conversion occurs, what kind of land that conversion occurred on, because could be lands that aren't very high in carbon, but if it happens to be peat lands somewhere in Southeast Asia, then those could be very high in terms of their carbon, the amount of carbon that they will release if they're converted. And so that whole issue in terms of where that change occurs and on what kind of land that change occurs on is one of the major points of uncertainty about that effect. I would hope that it would bring to mind some of the most pressing issues that the global food system faces and that policymakers need to pay most attention to. I would also hope that it generates debate that leads towards either greater investment in scientific research to resolve issues of uncertainty. It doesn't have to be in biofuels. There's many other issues of uncertainty that need to be resolved, and that helps to prioritize exactly what problems are the most pressing that we need to devote our attention to first. So I'm hoping that's what the readers will take away when they read through the Global Food Policy Report.